The F-104 Starfighter is an American single-engine, supersonic air superiority fighter that was actually extensively deployed as a fighter-bomber during the Cold War. It saw service with many different nations, and is counted among one of the most popular Cold War-era fighters due to its very distinctive design. The Starfighter is pretty easily recognizable due to a T-shaped tail, a very narrow, long fuselage that makes it look more like a rocket than a jet, and those wings! Those tiny, stubby baby wings. The specifications vary slightly depending on which exact model we're talking about, as there were also many versions of it, but its overall length was about 54 feet, 8 inches, with a wingspan of 21 feet, 9 inches, a height of 13 feet, 6 inches, an empty weight of 14,000 pounds, and a maximum takeoff weight of 29,027 pounds. By design, they were powered by General Electric J-79 afterburning turbojet engines, and they were the first jet in service with any military that could sustain a maximum speed of Mach 2. They were impressive aircraft for their time, but they did have a lot of growing pains, to be frank. Though not as many as people seem to think, as there's a lot of misinformation surrounding the Starfighter due to an accident rate that was a bit higher than normal, as well as certain activities by Lockheed in the background. All this combined to make the Starfighter look like a dangerous plane for the pilot, when in reality, well, like I said, it wasn't perfect, but there weren't exactly death traps either. The development of the F-104 can be traced back to Clarence L. Kelly Johnson, who was the Vice President of Engineering and Research at Lockheed's Skunk Works, their super-de-duper top-secret stuff. He visited U.S. Air Force bases in South Korea in November of 1951 to speak with the pilots about what they wanted and needed in a fighter aircraft, having now had experience flying against enemy MiGs. During the Korean War, American pilots first encountered the MiG-15, and at the time they were using the North American F-86 Sabres. Some of the pilots felt that the MiGs were actually superior to the larger and comparatively more complex F-86s. They felt that they'd be much better off with a smaller and more simple aircraft that complemented those particular attributes with excellent performance, specifically high speed and high altitude capabilities. Johnson went back to Lockheed and started designing an aircraft based on these requests. In March of 1952, his team was put together and they wound up studying over 100 different configurations for the aircraft. Small and simple was definitely the go-to when it came to designing this thing. In order to achieve the performance they wanted, they would need to do that, and the pilots had said that they wanted that anyway. A single engine design seemed to be the logical step, and they wound up choosing the brand new at the time General Electric J-79 turbojet for this. Johnson would wind up taking his new fighter concept to the U.S. Air Force on November 5th, 1952, and they were interested enough to create a general operational requirement for a lightweight fighter. 3 additional companies were also named finalists for this requirement. But Lockheed already had a head start since their design had inspired the concept in the first place. They were granted a development contract on March 12, 1953 for 2 prototypes, and they were designated the XF-104. Lockheed worked extremely fast and the mock-up was ready by the end of April, and with that approved, they started working on both prototypes. But they had an early hurdle in the fact that the J-79 engine was actually not ready yet. So the prototypes instead were built to use the Wright J-65 engine, which was a licensed constructed version of the Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire. The first prototype was finished at Lockheed's Burbank facility by early 1954, and the first flight took place on March 4th of that year. The total time from contract to first flight was less than a year, which is insanely fast for a military jet. Developing the F-104 was actually never really a secret, but the Air Force still kept certain things under wraps as best they could. Only a vague description was given when they first revealed that it existed, and no photographs of the aircraft were released to the public until 1956. And even at the public unveiling, the engine inlets were actually obscured with metal covers, and visible weapons, including the M61 Vulcan cannon, were also hidden. Early tests were promising, but not without their hiccups. The first flight, for example, only lasted 21 minutes due to a landing gear retraction problem. The second prototype was actually destroyed several weeks later during gun-firing trials because the hatch to the ejector seat actually blew out, which depressurized the cockpit. The pilot thought that this had crippled the aircraft, though he actually could have landed it had he tried, so he wound up ejecting. Despite the mishaps, by November 1st, 1955, the remaining prototype was accepted by the Air Force, and based on the testing, the next variant of the aircraft, dubbed the YF-104A, was lengthened and fitted with the finally ready J-79 engine. It was also given modified landing gear and modified air intakes. 17 of this new model were ordered by the Air Force on March 30th, 1955 for further tests, and the first of them would fly on February 17th, 1956. Lockheed continued making improvements to the plane throughout the testing period, and the first production F-104A to enter service was delivered to the 83rd Fighter Interceptor Wing on January 28, 1958. The F-104s were all metal, primarily duralumin, with some stainless steel and titanium for good measure, and the fuselage was 2.5 times as long as the plane's wingspan. The wings were centered on the horizontal reference plane, but were located farther aft on the fuselage than most contemporary designs. The wings, combined with the T-tail, combined with the speed of the plane, resulted in a, quirky beast, shall we say. The Starfighter is not a bad plane, nor is it inherently dangerous in the right hands, but they are definitely not as forgiving as many other planes would be, as we'll soon discuss. Their wings were extremely thin. In fact, the leading edges were so thin, only 0.016 of an inch, or 0.41 millimeters, that they were actually a hazard to ground crews. Protective guards had to be installed on them during maintenance, and that meant fuel tanks and landing gear had to be placed in the fuselage. Due to the thin wings, the landing speed on the F-104s was very, very high, so the designers had to develop a boundary layer control system, or BLCS, which consisted of high-pressure bleed air which was blown over the trailing edge flaps to lower the landing speeds to help make the process safer. Landing without BLCS engaged was only done in emergencies and was a terrifying experience, frankly. Due to their high T-shaped tails, the early ejection seats actually were downward firing, but this presented a problem for low-altitude escapes. In fact, 22 U.S. Air Force pilots would fail to escape from their aircraft due to this problem. Later, they would be replaced with more conventional upward-firing ejection seats that were powerful enough to clear the tail. And when it came to operating for the U.S. Air Force, it was designed as an air superiority fighter, but the Air Force tended to use them as supersonic interceptors. Now, from a speed perspective, the F-104 would be great for that, but not from a range or armament perspective. They were small, so they couldn't carry very much, and they couldn't go very far, but they could still do it well enough for the time. And the first taste of any kind of action took place during the Taiwan Strait crisis of 1958. The 104s did not actually engage any enemy fighters during this time, but they did act as a solid deterrent. They would be deployed again during the Berlin crisis of 1961, and again act as a deterrent, and they would also be involved in the Vietnam War. Though they did plenty of missions, they actually never had any air-to-air kills, and the pilots in the F-104s, who definitely encountered MiGs, started getting the impression that the North Vietnamese just weren't engaging them on purpose. By that point, the North Vietnamese did know about the F-104's performance, so the running theory was that they were either told or just straight up refused to actually engage with the Starfighters. They'll fight anything else, but not them. No, not that one. Absolutely not. No, no, no. Scary. But the 104s were fast. Really, really fast. And they would continue using them until July of 1967, when all the Starfighter units transitioned to McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom IIs instead. But the F-104 was hardly done being in service. Pakistan would get significant use out of them, as would Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Germany, Greece, Italy, Japan, Jordan, Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Taiwan, and Turkey. They were all over the world. But the one we're going to focus on for our purposes is West Germany, because that's where most of the problems, as well as stories about them, tend to crop up. The West German Luftwaffe did take plenty of F-104s, but they had a very high accident rate. And a few countries did have a slightly higher than average accident rate with them, and part of that's due to some early issues. Another part of it is, well, we'll get to that in a second. For one thing, the 104s have very high wing loading, which is only made worse when they were carrying external stores. This fact may not be a surprise given their wings barely exist, but during early stall tests it was found that the aircraft really liked pitching up once it reached an angle of attack of about 15 degrees. That would result in a rapid increase in angle of attack to approximately 60 degrees, accompanied by lateral and directional oscillation, which was followed by a sudden uncontrolled yaw and roll. By that point, the aircraft was just kind of out of control completely, so they had to have an automatic pitch control added to avoid this, as well as a stick shaker system to warn the pilot of an impending stall, and even if that was ignored, a stick pusher would force the aircraft to nose down to a safer angle of attack, although that was often overridden by the pilot, which was a bad call, but they did it. The T-tail also suffered flutter, because the horizontal tail center of gravity was aft of both the bending and torsional axis of the vertical tail to which it was attached. It was actually highly vulnerable to flutter at transonic speeds, and if it got bad enough, it could cause the tail to separate entirely from the aircraft. They also had serious issues with the J79 engine, which would become good engines, but they were brand new, and they had a lot of teething problems. Engine failure wasn't unusual, and early F-104s didn't have modulated afterburning, meaning that combat operations could only actually be performed at one of two settings, which was either maximum military power or full afterburner. To translate for those of you that don't know what that means, basically the pilots had two options, Mach 1 or Mach 2.2, nothing else. You want to go fast or really, really fast. There's no in between here. And the engines really like suffering from afterburner blowouts on takeoff, or sometimes even non-ignition, which would result in a major loss of thrust, and in that situation it was recommended that they abandon the takeoff entirely. But all the problems I've listed so far really mostly have a lot to do with teething issues with the planes themselves that weren't that unusual for jets at the time. The issue with the Luftwaffe in particular, and why so many of their planes went down, seems to be, well, frankly, kind of a skill issue. I don't mean it as a dig, but it's twofold. For one thing, since the end of World War II, a lot of pilots that they had settled into civilian work, and the F-104 was a far cry to the planes that they had been used to, if they had any experience at all. But that was kind of the other problem. So the US Air Force was well aware that the F-104 was a quirky beast, and would require a skilled hand in order to handle them. As a result, Starfighter pilots had to have at least 1,500 flight hours of experience prior to even touching these planes. But in West Germany, the pilots only had around 400, and that was a sizable difference in terms of understanding how to deal with this plane's peculiar traits. Eric Brown, British Royal Navy officer and test pilot who flew more aircraft, 487 types, than anyone else in history, did fly the Starfighter, and he described it as a hot ship that has to be flown every inch of the way. Basically, what he said, while the F-104 was capable, you needed to baby it. The pilot had to be paying attention and had to be vigilant with what was going on. There really wasn't any downtime when you flew a Starfighter. Eric Hartmann, who was this world's top-scoring fighter ace, also flew the plane in West Germany, and he actually deemed it to be an unsafe aircraft with poor handling characteristics for aerial combat. Regardless of how you slice it, the F-104s were certainly capable, but they were very, very needy birds that needed your full, undivided attention, otherwise they could get you killed. And Lockheed themselves didn't help this portrayal of them, because the F-104 was caught up in Lockheed's bribery scandals that happened around that time. Long story short, it was found that Lockheed was actually bribing politicians in foreign countries to spend their country's tax dollars to buy Lockheed aircraft. Lockheed would make more money on the sales in the long run, And since it was coming from tax dollars, the politicians will be lining their pockets in these arrangements. Lockheed had indeed spent some money on bribes in West Germany to get the F-104s into service, and that made it look like they were bribing the officials to look the other way with the safety issues, when in reality, no, they were just bribing them to buy them outright. It wasn't that they were using money to conceal the safety issues of the jet. They were just using the money to get more sales. It was still seedy, underhanded, and violently illegal, but it wasn't that they were paying them to buy a dangerous aircraft necessarily. Because the F-104 wasn't really dangerous, you just had to know what you were dealing with. Its speed and power was way ahead of the curve, and a lot of pilots weren't ready for that. The German press even called them Widowmakers as a nickname, though if you ask the pilots, the most common nickname for them was Zipper. And despite the controversies, they remained in service in some capacities for many, many years. Italy, for example, wouldn't retire their last Starfighters until 2004, and they're actually still in use, just not in military format. A few of them remain in civilian operation, with a Florida-based company known as Starfighters Incorporated that uses them for contract testing and flight simulations. The 104 also laid the groundwork for another famous plane, the Lockheed U-2, which was basically the prototype of the Starfighter with really big wings on it. And they set several world records during their time. The Starfighter was the first aircraft to simultaneously hold both the world speed and altitude records. And their popularity certainly can't be understated. Yeah, they were definitely quirky, and yeah, there were definitely a lot of issues to overcome, and you certainly had to know what you were dealing with whenever you got in the cockpit of one of these things. But at the end of the day, let's be fair, they're really cool, you guys. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Brian, Jack Carson's Raro Videos, Lord Off 444, Mark Holding, Murder Drone Stall, A Person 723, DM Trouble Typhoon, Royal Hood 2860, Icer for 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Mr. Sleepy, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, Ennis Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Ohio Trucker 1, Joshua Long, Andrew Bowen, Dr. Racer 78, Josh Johnson, Hayden DeGrow, Travis Delinsky, Caleb Rainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, and Oklahoma Hot Rail. Till next time, this is Darkness, and a bid well of fun. Farewell.